The Forgotten Bonds. The early morning light filtered through the heavy drapes in Robert Langston's bedroom, casting soft patterns across the walls of his grand estate. The room was still, quiet, almost too quiet. Robert's eyes opened at precisely 6:30 a.m., his internal clock unerring even after all these years. He moved through his morning routine, automated and unchanging. His silver hair was combed back, suit crisp, shoes shined. Yet, as he glanced at his reflection in the oversized mirror, the dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed a man who hadn't truly slept in years. Today was not just any day. It was the anniversary of his son, Caleb's, death. The sharp pang of loss stabbed him, as fresh as the day it happened. Caleb's life had been one of quiet rebellion, marked by a spirit that had been unfathomable to his father. Robert, the head of a multinational conglomerate, had always pushed his son toward success, envisioning him as his successor. But Caleb had been drawn to people, not profits, leaving Robert baffled and often resentful of his son's choices. As he descended the grand staircase, his gaze fell on the portrait of Caleb that hung prominently in the hall. Caleb's eyes seemed to follow him, his gentle smile preserved forever on the canvas. The sight of it made Robert's breath catch, his grip tightening around the banister. He quickly turned his head, unable to bear the silent reproach. Breakfast was ready as always, set meticulously on the long dining table that was otherwise empty. His only company was the housekeeper, Mrs. Ella, a quiet presence who had been with him since Caleb was a child. She placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him, along with a plate of eggs that went cold as he sat, staring at nothing. Mrs. Ella watched him quietly, her own heart heavy with the absence of Caleb's lively chatter that had once filled the house with warmth and light. "Will you be visiting him today, sir?" she asked softly, her voice barely breaking the silence. Robert nodded slowly. It was a tradition he kept each year, a ritual that felt more painful than comforting. He would go to Caleb's grave, lay a single rose, and leave. Every year he told himself it was enough. And yet, each year, the ache only grew deeper, lingering long after he'd left the cemetery gates. The walk to his car felt weighted, as if invisible chains bound him to the past he couldn't escape. He sank into the back seat, lost in thought. The car rolled quietly out of the estate, passing rows of meticulously trimmed hedges and winding driveways that spoke to the wealth he had amassed over his lifetime. But today, all he could feel was the emptiness those riches had left behind. When they arrived at the cemetery, Robert took a steadying breath, clutching the rose tightly in his hand. The crisp autumn air nipped at his face as he made his way toward the headstone. Fallen leaves rustled beneath his polished shoes, and the graveyard was silent save for the soft sounds of distant birdsong. He stopped in his tracks as he neared Caleb's grave, his breath catching at the sight before him. Two young girls, no older than 12 and 7, knelt at his son's headstone. They held hands, and the younger one clutched a bundle of wildflowers, her face pale and drawn with sadness. Robert's initial reaction was one of confusion and, admittedly, irritation. Who were these children? Why were they here at his son's grave, crying as if they had lost something precious? He stepped back, choosing to watch from a distance, curiosity overriding his desire to intervene. "Look, Eva," whispered the older girl, her voice soft but filled with a maturity beyond her years. "Mr. Caleb's birthday rose is here, just like he always liked." The younger girl's lips quivered as she reached out, placing the wildflowers beside the rose Robert had brought. "He'd always bring us flowers, too, remember. He said everyone deserves something beautiful." Robert's chest tightened as he strained to hear more. Caleb had spoken of these girls, brought them flowers. He tried to piece together their connection, but every answer slipped through his grasp. "I miss his stories," the younger girl said, her voice barely audible. "Remember how he made up funny voices for all the characters?" The older girl nodded, brushing away a tear. "And how he'd help me with my math. He said everyone should get a chance to learn, no matter what." Robert felt his heart twist with a pang of regret, realizing that these girls knew a side of his son he'd never taken the time to understand. His grip on the rose tightened, and he took a step forward, finally making his presence known. The girls startled, looking up at him with wide, wary eyes. "Excuse me," Robert began, his voice unsteady. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just wondering. How did you know Caleb?" The older girl looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of caution and pain. She took her sister's hand, holding it tightly as if drawing strength. He was our friend," she said softly. "He'd visit us at the orphanage and help us with our schoolwork. He was there when no one else was." Robert swallowed hard, his mind reeling. An orphanage. Caleb had never mentioned visiting one, much less spending time there. The realization struck him like a blow, unraveling the memories of countless arguments they'd had, each one pushing Caleb further away. The younger girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "He said we were like his little sisters," she whispered, her small hand gripping her sister's tightly. She looked up at Robert, her innocent eyes brimming with a sorrow far too deep for a child. "We didn't get to say goodbye." Her words hit Robert with a force he hadn't anticipated, leaving him speechless. He had come to pay his respects to his son, to perform his ritual of mourning. But these girls, standing before him with tears in their eyes, held a piece of Caleb's life he had never known. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on Robert's shoulders, and for the first time, he felt a crack in the stoic facade he'd so carefully maintained. "I didn't know," he said quietly, more to himself than to the girls. "I didn't know he did any of this." The older girl, her face softened with a surprising gentleness, nodded. "He didn't talk about it much. He just wanted to help. He told us. He wanted us to feel loved." The last words lingered in the air, and Robert felt his chest constrict as the full impact of them sank in. Caleb, his son, had found a purpose that he, Robert, had dismissed as trivial, a mere hobby. Yet here were the fruits of that purpose. Two young girls whose lives had been touched, and perhaps even transformed, by his son's kindness. Robert managed a nod, his voice faltering. "Thank you for telling me this. I'm sorry for your loss." The older girl gave him a sad smile, the wisdom in her eyes far beyond her years. "Thank you, Mr. Langston," Robert replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Robert Langston, Caleb's father." The girls nodded, and after a moment, they turned to leave. Robert stood frozen, watching as they walked hand in hand down the path, their small figures growing smaller in the distance. He was left alone with the rose in his hand, and a crushing realization of just how much he had lost, how much he had never known, settling over him like a shadow. For the first time, standing in the quiet cemetery, Robert felt his own loneliness echoing back at him, stark and unyielding. Caleb had left him with a legacy he hadn't wanted to see, a world he had never thought to understand. And now, perhaps, it was too late to make things right. But as he stood there, staring at his son's grave, a new thought took root. A chance, perhaps, to honor Caleb's memory by finding a way to bridge the gap between them. And as he turned back towards his car, the image of the two girls lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder of the journey that lay ahead. The unseen legacy. The sun had barely risen when Robert found himself back in his study, staring at the leather-bound notebook he picked up from his son's room the night before. The notebook was filled with Caleb's familiar handwriting, pages upon pages of words that Robert had never taken the time to read until now. It had been Caleb's journal, one that he'd carried everywhere, filled with notes and reflections about people and places that were unknown to Robert. He opened it, feeling a strange sense of reverence for each word Caleb had left behind. The first few pages contained Caleb's musings about life, written in his unguarded, heartfelt style. Robert had always thought of Caleb as sensitive, perhaps too sensitive for the business world. But as he read, he realized that his son's sensitivity had been his strength, a strength he had never understood. One entry, dated over a year ago, caught his eye. Caleb had written, "Met two amazing girls today, Eva and Leela. They're like little lights in a dark room, shining despite everything they've been through. They remind me of how Mom used to be with me, so full of love, even when life was hard. I want to do whatever I can to help them." Robert's eyes lingered on the words, his chest tightening with a familiar ache. These were the girls he'd met at the cemetery, the same ones who had spoken of Caleb with such fondness. As he continued to read, he found more entries about them, each one painted with the colors of a bond he had never known existed. In another entry, Caleb had written, "Eva's been struggling with math. I promised her I'd help her get her grades up. Lila is such a joy. She's always got this big smile that makes you want to believe in good things. They're both stronger than I ever was at their age." Robert's hand shook as he closed the journal. He could see it all so clearly now. His son had been a pillar in the lives of these young girls, someone they could rely on, someone who had given them hope when they had nothing. And in doing so, he had become everything Robert had tried to mold him away from, a man with a heart, one who valued people over profits. For a long time, Robert sat in silence, his mind flooded with memories of his son. How many times had Caleb tried to tell him about his work with the community, only to be met with indifference or worse, criticism? He remembered the last time they'd argued, Caleb's voice filled with frustration and hurt as he tried to explain why he felt drawn to these causes. Robert had brushed him off, calling it a distraction, a waste of his potential. Now, every careless word he'd spoken weighed down on him like a stone. Unable to shake his sense of guilt, Robert made a decision. He had to know more about his son's life, about the people he'd touched and the ways he'd spent his time. And so, he picked up the phone and dialed his assistant's number. "Margaret," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, "I need you to find some information for me. I want everything you can get about a place called the Larchwood Community Center. Caleb used to volunteer there. And," he hesitated, feeling the unfamiliar weight of humility, "I also need to know about the Johnson family, specifically Eva and Leela Johnson." Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she replied, "I'll get started right away, Mr. Langston." After he hung up, Robert sat back, staring at the ceiling. His office was filled with reminders of his life's work, awards, certificates, photos from various company events. But now, for the first time, they felt empty, hollow. He had built an empire, yes, but in doing so, he had overlooked the most valuable thing in his life: his son. A few days later, Margaret arrived at Robert's office, a file in hand. She placed it on his desk, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in years: concern. Robert nodded, grateful for her discretion, and opened the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, and a few handwritten notes. As he read, the story of Caleb's life unfolded before him, one he'd never been part of. Margaret explained quietly, "The Larchwood Community Center is in one of the city's poorer neighborhoods. Caleb volunteered there several times a week, sometimes even on weekends. He organized programs for children, tutoring, sports activities, holiday events, and he did all of this without ever mentioning it to anyone here." She handed him a photo of Caleb surrounded by children at the center. In the picture, his son's face was lit up with joy, a joy Robert had rarely seen in his presence. He could see Eva and Leela in the crowd, their small faces smiling up at Caleb with a look of adoration. They'd lost their parents in a car accident 3 years ago, Margaret informed him, and had been living in foster care until Caleb had found them. He'd become their mentor, their friend, even something of a father figure. Robert's fingers traced over the photograph, his heart heavy with regret. "He did all of this," he murmured, almost to himself, "and I never knew." Margaret nodded, her voice soft. "He cared deeply, Mr. Langston. He was passionate about helping others, especially those who couldn't help themselves. These girls, they were his family." The word hit Robert hard. Family. Caleb had created his own family, a family he hadn't shared with his father because he'd known Robert wouldn't understand. The realization was like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. "Is there anything else?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he could bear to hear more. Margaret hesitated, then handed him a letter. This was the last thing he wrote before he died. It's addressed to the girls. With trembling hands, Robert unfolded the letter, reading Caleb's familiar scrawl. "My dear Eva and Leela, you've both been such a bright light in my life, a reminder of what truly matters. Remember, you are loved, and you are worthy of every good thing this world has to offer. No matter what happens, hold on to each other and keep pushing forward. You have a strength that is rare and beautiful. Never let anyone take that from you. With all my love, Caleb." The letter fell from Robert's hands, landing softly on the desk. The room was silent, yet he felt as if the echoes of his son's words lingered, filling the empty space around him. In that moment, he knew he couldn't walk away. He couldn't let Caleb's legacy fade into obscurity, buried under the weight of his own pride and ignorance. He looked up at Margaret, his eyes clear with purpose. "Margaret, arrange a meeting with the director of the Larchwood Community Center. I want to know everything they need to keep this place running, and reach out to the Johnson family as well. I'd like to meet with them, if they're willing." Margaret smiled softly. "Of course, Mr. Langston." The following week, Robert arrived at the Larchwood Community Center. The building was modest, its walls faded and its floors scuffed, but it was alive with the laughter of children and the voices of volunteers. As he walked through the doors, he felt a strange sense of belonging, as if he were stepping into a part of his son's world. Linda Morales, the director, greeted him warmly. She was a woman in her 60s with a kind face and a firm handshake. She led him through the center, pointing out various projects Caleb had helped with. Caleb was a rare soul, she said as they passed a bulletin board covered with photos of smiling children. He wasn't just here to volunteer. He was here to make a difference. He started the tutoring program, organized weekend events, even set up a scholarship fund for some of our brightest kids, and he did all of this without seeking recognition. Robert's throat tightened as he listened. He had known his son was different, but he had never truly understood the depth of his compassion, the extent of his dedication. Here, among these children and volunteers, Caleb had found his purpose, a purpose Robert had dismissed as unworthy of his time. As they reached the end of the tour, Linda turned to him, her eyes filled with compassion. "I understand this must be hard for you, Mr. Langston, but Caleb's work here meant the world to him. If there's anything you can do to help, I know it would honor his memory." Robert nodded, his mind already racing with ideas. He would do whatever it took to support this center, to keep Caleb's legacy alive. It was the least he could do for a son he had failed to understand. That evening, Robert sat alone in his study, staring at the photos he'd taken from the center. He saw Caleb in each image, his son's smile, his open heart, his willingness to give. And for the first time, Robert felt a glimmer of peace, a sense that perhaps in honoring Caleb's legacy, he could find a way to heal. But there was still one thing left to do. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd received from Margaret that morning. It was the bonds we build. The following Saturday, Robert found himself standing outside the Blue Door Cafe, an unassuming spot nestled on a corner of Marshall Street. The neighborhood had seen better days. The once vibrant storefronts were now faded, their paint chipping and windows covered in a thin layer of dust. But the cafe itself exuded a quiet warmth, with handwritten signs in the windows offering daily specials and a bell that chimed softly as he entered. Inside, the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and pastries, and the walls were adorned with local artwork, a stark contrast to the cold marble and glass of Robert's world. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He was a stranger here, stepping into a place he'd once dismissed as unimportant, a world his son had embraced. Seated in a quiet corner were two familiar faces. Eva and Leela sat side by side, their small hands wrapped around steaming mugs of cocoa. Their aunt, Clara Johnson, was a sturdy woman with kind eyes and a protective air, her gaze assessing as she spotted Robert. He approached, his nerves unexpectedly raw, feeling as if he were on the edge of a precipice he could not pull back from. Clara rose and extended her hand, her grip firm. "Mr. Langston," she said, her tone polite but guarded. "Thank you for meeting me," he replied, his voice softer than he intended. He looked down at the girls, both of whom were watching him intently. Eva's expression was cautious, her eyes sharp and discerning, while Layla's held an open curiosity tinged with the lingering sadness of loss. He cleared his throat. I wanted to meet you both. I wanted to learn more about Caleb, about the work he did here and the time he spent with you." Clara motioned for him to sit, and he lowered himself into the chair opposite them. The cafe bustled around them, but in their small corner, time seemed to slow. Robert found himself at a loss, uncertain of where to begin. These were Caleb's people, the family he had chosen, and he was an outsider. Leela broke the silence first. "Mr. Langston, are you like Mr. Caleb?" Her innocent question caught him off guard, and he hesitated, searching for the right answer. How could he explain the differences between him and his son, the walls he had built that Caleb had spent his life trying to tear down? "No," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I'm not like Caleb, but I would like to understand him, and I think you can help me with that." Eva studied him, her gaze unwavering. She looked so much older than her years, a seriousness in her eyes that seemed out of place on such a young face. "Caleb was more than just a volunteer," she said softly, her voice filled with a weight that echoed the truth of her words. "He was there for us when no one else was. He used to say we were like his little sisters." Robert swallowed hard, feeling the familiar pang of regret. He had never understood why Caleb spent so much time here, why he poured himself into helping others when there was a world of opportunity waiting for him in the family business. Now, sitting across from these girls, he could see it clearly. Caleb had found something here that Robert could never give him: purpose, connection, and a chance to make a difference. Clara placed a gentle hand on Eva's shoulder, grounding her niece. "Caleb was an anchor for them," she explained, her voice calm but firm. "After their parents passed, he was one of the few constants in their lives. He didn't just show up now and then. He was committed. He helped with homework. He took them to the park. He listened to their worries. He was family." The word hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Family. He had always thought of Caleb as his family. But now he realized that family wasn't something bound by blood. It was about presence, care, and dedication. Things Caleb had given to these girls, things Robert had withheld from his own son. "I didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know he cared so deeply." Eva's eyes softened slightly, but her expression remained guarded. "He told us stories about you," she said quietly, "about how you worked hard and built your business. He said you were strong." Robert's throat tightened, the words catching him off guard. Caleb had spoken well of him. After all their disagreements, the arguments, the times Robert had belittled his son's passions, Caleb had still respected him. "He would have wanted us to get to know you," Eva continued, her gaze dropping to her mug. "That's why we came to the cemetery, to tell him that we remembered him. We didn't have anyone else to tell." The raw honesty in her words was almost too much to bear, and Robert found himself struggling to maintain his composure. The children's lives were marked by losses he could scarcely imagine, and yet here they were, still carrying on, still honoring the memory of his son. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "I'm sorry that I didn't know Caleb better. I'm sorry for not being there for him, or for you." He paused, taking a steadying breath. "But I'd like to change that. I want to be here for you, if you'll let me." Clara's expression softened, though her eyes remained cautious. "Mr. Langston, we don't need charity. Caleb didn't do this for recognition or reward. He did it because he cared. If you want to be a part of their lives, It needs to be because you care too. The truth of her words settled over him, grounding him. This wasn't about money or reputation. It was about something far deeper. It was about honoring Caleb's legacy, about stepping into the world his son had cherished. Robert nodded slowly. I understand. And I do care. I didn't know Caleb well enough in life, but perhaps I can get to know him through you, through the people he loved. Clara seemed to weigh his words, finally giving a nod. Very well. The girls need stability, someone they can count on. If you're willing to be that person, then we can see how this goes. Eva's gaze softened, and Leela offered a shy smile, her small hand reaching out to touch Robert's. He took it gently, surprised by the warmth that filled him at her touch. It was a simple gesture, yet it held a world of meaning, a tentative bridge between his old life and the new path that lay ahead. Over the following weeks, Robert found himself returning to the community center, spending time with Eva and Leela, volunteering in small ways that felt foreign but fulfilling. He helped with homework, sat in on tutoring sessions, even took part in the weekly cleanup efforts. The children had initially been wary of him, a stranger in their world, but gradually they began to warm up to him. One rainy afternoon, as he was sweeping the center's hallway, Eva approached him, clutching a crumpled sheet of paper. She looked up at him, her eyes uncertain. Mr. Langston, she began, hesitating. Caleb. He was helping me with my scholarship essay. He said I could get into a good high school if I worked hard, but I'm not sure I can do it without him. Robert knelt down, taking the paper from her hands. Her words filled him with a strange sense of purpose, a chance to continue the work his son had started. I'll help you, Eva, he promised, his voice steady. We'll make sure this essay is the best it can be. Caleb believed in you, and so do I. Eva's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude, and she gave him a small, genuine smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile since they'd met, and it filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. They worked on the essay together, Robert offering guidance while Eva shared her dreams and ambitions. She wanted to be a doctor, she confided, a dream inspired by her mother, who had always encouraged her to pursue her education. Caleb had been the one to tell her she could achieve anything, that her dreams were worth fighting for. As they finished the essay, Eva looked at him, her eyes filled with hope. Thank you, Mr. Langston, she said softly, for helping me, for caring. Robert felt a lump rise in his throat, and he nodded, unable to find the words. In that moment, he realized that he was the one being changed, shaped by these small acts of kindness and connection. He had come here to honor Caleb, but in doing so, he was finding a new purpose, a new way of being. Leela ran over, clutching a book in her hands, her eyes wide with excitement. Mr. Langston, can you read this to us? Caleb used to read it all the time. He took the book from her hands, recognizing it as one of Caleb's favorite childhood stories. As he began to read aloud, the girls snuggled up beside him, listening with rapt attention. His voice filled the small room, mingling with the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, and for the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet joy that came not from success or wealth, but from something far deeper, the simple act of being there, of offering love and support. Days turned into weeks, and Robert's visits became a regular part of the center's routine. He was no longer just Mr. Langston, the millionaire. He was Robert, a friend and mentor, someone who cared. The children came to him with questions, requests for help, and even stories about their days. And each time, he listened, offering guidance and encouragement, discovering a side of himself he had never known. One evening, as he was leaving the center, Clara stopped him at the door. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else. Respect. Thank you, Robert, she said softly, for being here, for helping. You've made a difference. He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. He had come here seeking redemption, a way to make up for the years he had lost with Caleb. But what he had found was something far greater. A sense of connection, a family, a life that was rich in ways he had never imagined. As he drove home that night, he felt a warmth in his heart, a quiet sense of fulfillment that filled the empty spaces Caleb's absence had left behind. And he knew, without a doubt, that he would continue this journey, honoring his son's legacy, one small act of kindness at a time. Steps toward redemption. The weeks passed in a blur, each day drawing Robert deeper into a world he had never imagined himself part of. The community center had become a sanctuary for him, a place that welcomed him without pretense or expectation. It was a sharp contrast to the polished boardrooms and grand offices he was accustomed to, yet here he felt a strange and humbling sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Robert felt a clarity he hadn't known was possible. But the path was not without obstacles. Though he tried his best to be present for the girls and to support the community center, Robert struggled to shake off the remnants of his old life. The habits of control, the need for order, and his tendency to solve problems with money rather than understanding. One day, as he was helping Leela with her math homework, Eva approached him with a tentative expression. She was clutching a notebook close to her chest, her fingers drumming nervously on its worn cover. "Mr. Langston," she began softly, "there's something I think you should see." Robert looked up, setting down his pen. "Of course, Eva. What is it?" Eva hesitated, her eyes flicking to the notebook, as if debating whether to share it with him. Finally, she held it out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Caleb gave this to me. It's kind of a journal. He told me to write down my thoughts, my dreams. He said that if you write something down, it becomes real." Robert took the notebook from her, his heart aching as he recognized his son's influence on the young girl. Caleb had always encouraged others to follow their dreams, to believe in themselves. It was a quality Robert had once dismissed as impractical, but now he saw its profound impact. He opened the notebook, his eyes scanning the first page. It was filled with Eva's neat handwriting, listing her hopes and goals. She wanted to become a doctor, to help people just as Caleb had helped her. As he turned the pages, he found sketches of her ideal clinic, notes on medical topics, and clippings from science magazines. It was clear that her dream was more than just a passing fancy. It was a vision shaped and nurtured by his son. "He told me I could be anything I wanted to be," Eva murmured, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Even when things got hard, he said I was strong enough to make it." Robert's throat tightened as he read, realizing the depth of his son's faith in this young girl. Caleb had given her more than encouragement. He had given her a sense of purpose, a belief in her own potential. And now, holding her dreams in his hands, Robert felt a responsibility he couldn't ignore. "You can do this, Eva," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Eva looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude and something else, a glimmer of trust. It was a fragile thing, hard-earned, and easily broken. But in that moment, Robert knew he would do whatever it took to honor Caleb's legacy by supporting Eva's dreams. As the days turned into weeks, Robert began to take on a more active role at the community center. He volunteered in the tutoring program, helped with the weekend activities, and even organized a small fundraiser to support the center's projects. He quickly learned that while financial support was helpful, it was his time and attention that the children valued most. Yet, despite his progress, he still felt the weight of his old life pulling him back. His board members had grown increasingly concerned by his frequent absences, and Richard Bennett, his right-hand man and the company's second-in-command, had scheduled a meeting to discuss the future of Langston Enterprises. It was a conversation Robert had been avoiding, but he knew it couldn't be postponed forever. On the day of the meeting, he returned to his office, feeling a strange sense of alienation as he stepped into the polished lobby. The walls gleamed with plaques bearing his name, each one a testament to the success he had built. But now, as he walked past them, they felt empty, devoid of the meaning he once found in them. Richard was waiting for him in the conference room, his expression stern. "Robert, "We need to talk," he began, closing the door behind him. "The board is concerned. You've been absent more frequently, and your focus seems divided." Robert nodded, bracing himself. He had known this conversation was inevitable. "I understand, Richard, and I appreciate the board's patience." Richard frowned, his gaze unwavering. "Robert, the company needs you. We've built this empire together, and now is not the time for distractions. Langston Enterprises needs a steady hand." Robert sighed, feeling the familiar pull of his old life, but as he looked around the room, he realized that the empire he had built now felt like a gilded cage. He had spent his life accumulating wealth and power, but in doing so, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered: his son. "Richard," he said quietly, "I've come to realize that there's more to life than quarterly profits and market shares. Caleb taught me that." He paused, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not leaving the company, but my priorities have changed. I need to be present in the community, to honor my son's legacy." Richard's expression softened, but his eyes remained skeptical. "And what does that mean for Langston Enterprises? Are you prepared to step back?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Robert found himself considering a future where he wasn't at the helm of the company. The thought was both liberating and terrifying, but he knew it was the only way forward. "I'll make arrangements," he said finally, his voice calm. "I'll ensure that the company is in good hands. But my place is with the community, with the people Caleb cared about." Richard nodded slowly, though the resignation in his eyes was clear. "Then I'll inform the board. And I hope you find what you're looking for, Robert." That evening, Robert returned to the community center, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt free, unburdened by the expectations of his old life. He walked through the center's doors, greeted by the laughter of children and the familiar warmth of the space. Eva and Leela spotted him and ran over, their faces lighting up with joy. Lila tugged on his sleeve, her eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Langston, can you come see the garden we planted? It's growing." Robert smiled, allowing himself to be led to the small garden Caleb had helped start. The children had planted flowers, vegetables, and herbs, each one a testament to Caleb's legacy. As he knelt beside the garden, Leela handed him a small watering can, her face beaming with pride. "Caleb used to water them every day," she said softly. "He said they needed love to grow." Robert felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the garden, each plant a reminder of the life Caleb had built, a life filled with love and kindness. He realized that he was no longer just an observer in this world. He was a part of it, a guardian of the legacy his son had left behind. As he watered the plants, Eva knelt beside him, her gaze thoughtful. "Mr. Langston," she began hesitantly, Do you ever wish things had been different with Caleb?" The question took him by surprise, but he nodded, his voice filled with regret. "Yes, Eva. I wish I had understood him better. I wish I had seen the goodness in him sooner." Eva placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her small gesture filled with compassion. "I think he knew," she said softly. "He used to tell us that everyone has their own way of showing love. He said you loved him in the best way you knew how." Robert's heart ached with the truth of her words. Caleb had seen past his flaws, had understood him in a way that Robert had never deserved. And now he had been given a second chance, a chance to honor his son's memory by giving the love and support he had once withheld. As the months passed, Robert's life took on a new rhythm. He split his time between the community center and his responsibilities at the company, though he had gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operations. He had appointed a new CEO, a trusted colleague who shared his vision for responsible business practices, allowing him to focus on his work with the center. Eva's scholarship application was accepted, and she was awarded a grant to attend a prestigious high school. The joy in her eyes when she received the news was a moment Robert would never forget. He had promised to support her through her journey, and he intended to keep that promise, just as Caleb would have. Leela, too, blossomed under his care. She had once been shy and withdrawn, but now she was a vibrant presence, full of laughter and mischief. Robert found himself reading to her every afternoon, sharing stories that Caleb had once told him. Each story was a reminder of his son, a bridge connecting him to the life he had missed. One afternoon, as he was reading to Leela, she looked up at him with a serious expression. "Mr. Langston, do you think Caleb would be proud of you?" The question caught him off guard, and he felt a pang of vulnerability. He looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of his mistakes. "I hope so, Leela. I hope he would see that I'm trying to be the person he always believed I could be." Leela smiled, her small hand reaching out to squeeze his. "He would. I know he would." Robert felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He had spent his life chasing success, building an empire, but now he understood that true wealth was measured not in money, but in love, in the lives he touched, in the people he helped. And as he sat there, surrounded by the children he had come to care for, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Caleb's legacy was alive, woven into the fabric of the community, and he was a part of it. In honoring his son's memory, Robert had found redemption, a chance to rewrite his story, and a place in a family he had never known he needed. The gift of second chances. Robert stood in the doorway of the community center, watching as the children scurried through the hallways, their voices filling the space with laughter and excitement. It was Saturday afternoon, and the center was hosting its annual Family Day, a celebration Caleb had started years ago. Robert had taken it upon himself to organize the event this year, determined to make it as memorable as possible. Decorations adorned the walls, streamers, balloons, and banners, each one painstakingly put up by volunteers and the children themselves. Tables were set up with food, games, and crafts, and a stage had been assembled in the main hall for the talent show Caleb had always hosted. As he looked around, Robert felt a swell of pride, mixed with the familiar ache of missing his son. This event had been Caleb's gift to the community, a chance to bring families together, even those who didn't share blood. As he mingled with the crowd, he spotted Eva and Leela, helping to set up a table for arts and crafts. Eva was meticulously arranging supplies, while Leela chatted animatedly with a group of younger children. They looked up as he approached, their faces lighting up with joy. "Mr. Langston," Leela called, her voice bright. "Look at our table. We even have glitter glue." Robert chuckled, crouching beside them. "I see that. You've done an amazing job. This place looks wonderful." Eva's smile was shy but genuine. "Thank you for doing this, Mr. Langston. Caleb would be. He'd be so happy." Robert placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm just carrying on what he started," he replied softly. "He left something beautiful here, and it's my honor to help it grow." A few minutes later, Clara joined them, her face beaming with pride. "Robert, I have to say, this is the best family day we've had in years. Caleb would be proud of you." Robert nodded, feeling the warmth settle over him. "Thank you, Clara. That means more than you know." As the afternoon wore on, Robert found himself drawn into the energy of the event. He helped Leela paint a mural on the wall, played a game of dodgeball with the older kids, and even took a turn in the makeshift photo booth. He laughed more that afternoon than he had in years, his heart full as he watched the joy in the faces of the children, parents, and volunteers. But as the sun began to set and the event wound down, Robert felt a tug of melancholy. Amid the laughter and celebration, a part of him still felt the absence of his son, a presence that was woven into every corner of this place, but was forever just out of reach. After Family Day, Robert's connection to the community only deepened. He became a regular fixture at the center, attending board meetings, supporting initiatives Caleb had started, and even launching new programs aimed at providing academic support and job training for teens. Each day, he found himself learning more about his son, through the people who had known and loved him. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the center, Linda Morales, the center's director, approached him with a thoughtful expression. She held a small leather-bound notebook in her hands, its pages worn and filled with Caleb's handwriting. "I found this while organizing Caleb's things," she said, handing it to him. "I thought you might want to see it." He used to write in it every week. Plans for the center, ideas for new programs, even thoughts on life. Robert took the notebook, his heart pounding as he felt the familiar weight of Caleb's words. "Thank you, Linda. This means a lot." She nodded, her gaze kind but discerning. "You know, Robert, you've come a long way since you first walked through those doors. I think Caleb would be proud of what you're doing here." The words brought a lump to Robert's throat, and he swallowed hard, nodding. "I hope so, Linda. I really hope so." That night, alone in his study, Robert opened the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. The pages were filled with Caleb's thoughts and reflections, each one a glimpse into the mind of a man Robert had only begun to understand. There were sketches of program ideas, notes on the children he'd mentored, and lists of resources he wanted to bring to the center. But one entry stood out, dated just a few months before Caleb's death. "Sometimes I wonder if my dad will ever see me the way I see him. I've tried to show him what matters to me, but it's like we're on different planets. But maybe that's okay. I'll keep doing what I believe in, because at the end of the day, it's not about anyone else. It's about making a difference. And if that's all I leave behind, then I can live with that." Robert's hands shook as he read the words, his heart breaking at the quiet resignation in his son's voice. Caleb had carried his dreams alone, without the support of the father who should have been his biggest champion. The weight of his regret was overwhelming, but he knew there was only one thing to do: to carry forward the work his son had started, to honor Caleb's legacy by giving everything he had to this community. A month later, Robert found himself facing an unexpected challenge. The community center's funding was under threat, and the city council was considering reallocating funds to other projects. Without this support, the center would struggle to keep its doors open, and everything Caleb had built would be at risk. Determined not to let that happen, Robert attended a town hall meeting, standing before the council to advocate for the center's importance. The room was packed with community members, parents, and volunteers, all there to show their support. As Robert stood at the podium, he felt a surge of purpose, a fire he hadn't felt in years. "This center isn't just a building," he began, his voice steady. "It's a lifeline for the people in this community. It provides a safe space, resources, and support for children and families who need it most. My son, Caleb, dedicated his life to this place. He believed in these kids, in their potential and their dreams. And I believe in them too." He paused, looking out at the crowd, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm here today not just as a donor or a volunteer, but as a father who has learned the hard way what it means to truly care. This center is Caleb's legacy, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that it continues to thrive." The room erupted in applause, and as he looked into the faces of the people he had come to care for, Robert felt a surge of pride. He was no longer just honoring Caleb's memory. He was part of the community, fighting for the same cause his son had championed. After the meeting, as people gathered around to thank him, Eva and Leela approached, their faces shining with admiration. "You did it, Mr. Langston." Leela cheered, her eyes bright. "You saved the center." Robert smiled, kneeling down to hug her. "No, Leela," he said gently. "We saved it. All of us." Eva looked at him, her gaze filled with a depth of understanding that belied her young age. "Caleb would be so proud of you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Robert felt a lump rise in his throat, and he nodded, his heart full. "I hope so, Eva. I really hope so." As the months went by, Robert continued to grow closer to Eva and Leela, becoming a father figure in their lives. He attended Eva's school events, helped her with her studies, and even took Layla to her first baseball game, an experience she had always dreamed of. They had become his family, filling the void Caleb's absence had left, and in turn, he had become a source of stability and love in their lives. One evening, as he was tucking Leela into bed, she looked up at him with a serious expression. "Mr. Langston, do you think Caleb is watching over us?" The question took him by surprise, and he paused, his heart heavy with emotion. "Yes, Leela," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think he's watching over all of us, and I think he's happy to see how much love we're sharing." Leela smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep, her small hand still holding his. And as he sat beside her, Robert felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. That night, as he lay in bed, Robert thought of Caleb, his heart filled with gratitude for the journey his son had led him on. He had started this journey seeking redemption, a way to make up for the years he had lost with Caleb. But along the way, he had found something far more valuable: a family, a purpose, and a legacy that was as much his as it was Caleb's. The following day, Robert returned to the center, where Linda handed him a letter from one of the children Caleb had mentored years ago. It was a thank you letter, filled with memories of Caleb's kindness and encouragement, and as Robert read it, he felt a deep sense of pride in his son's legacy. He knew he still had a long way to go, that there were challenges ahead and memories that would always bring a pang of regret. But he also knew that he was no longer alone on this journey. He had Eva, Leela, and a community that had become his family, a family bound not by blood, but by love, resilience, and hope. And as he stood in the heart of the community center, surrounded by laughter and joy, he felt a warmth that no amount of wealth could ever buy. He had found his purpose, his redemption, and a place to call home. In honoring Caleb's legacy, Robert had finally discovered the man he was meant to be. A legacy fulfilled. Spring brought fresh beginnings to the Larchwood Community Center, with flowers blooming in the small garden and a warm breeze carrying laughter and chatter from the playground. Robert had helped plant that garden with the children just a few months earlier, a small project that had grown to symbolize Caleb's legacy, a mix of hard work, patience, and the beauty of nurturing something to life. Each day at the center had deepened Robert's sense of belonging, filling a place in his heart he once thought would remain empty forever. Eva and Leela were waiting for him in the garden, their faces beaming with excitement. Today marked a milestone: the unveiling of a new scholarship fund Robert had established in Caleb's name. The fund would support children from the community in pursuing their dreams, providing them with educational opportunities Caleb had once offered on his own. As Robert approached the girls, Leela ran up to him, her smile wide. "Mr. Langston, you'll never guess what we did. We picked the first flower from the garden. Look." She held up a small white blossom, its petals delicate and pure. "It's for Caleb." The sight of the flower, so simple yet filled with meaning, brought a lump to Robert's throat. He took it gently, his voice soft. "Thank you, Leela. I think Caleb would have loved it." They made their way to the community center's main hall, where families, volunteers, and local officials had gathered for the ceremony. As they entered, Robert felt the weight of this moment, a culmination of his journey and Caleb's impact on the community. The new scholarship fund would honor Caleb's memory, but it would also ensure that his dream lived on, giving hope to children who needed it most. He took the stage, feeling the gaze of the crowd upon him. He was no longer Robert Langston, the distant millionaire. Here, he was a friend, a mentor, and a part of this family. He looked at Eva and Leela, sitting in the front row, their faces filled with pride and anticipation. Clearing his throat, Robert began. "When I first came to the Larchwood Community Center, I thought I was here to honor my son. Caleb had a heart that saw the best in everyone, and he believed that every child deserves a chance to thrive. But what I've come to realize is that Caleb's legacy is far greater than any one person. It lives in this community, in each of you." He paused, looking out at the faces of parents, teachers, and children who had become part of his life. The Caleb Langston Scholarship Fund is not just about providing financial aid. It's about continuing the work my son started, about helping others find the courage to pursue their dreams, just as Caleb helped so many of you." A ripple of applause swept through the crowd, and Robert felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This was his way of making amends, of showing his son the love and pride he had never been able to express in life. And in honoring Caleb's legacy, he had found a new purpose, a life filled with meaning and connection. After the ceremony, as people congratulated him and expressed their gratitude, Robert spotted Linda Morales, the center's director, standing by the door with a thoughtful expression. "Robert," she began, her tone gentle, "you've done something remarkable here. I know Caleb would be proud." Robert gave a quiet nod. "Thank you, Linda. I never thought I'd find myself here, but it feels right. It feels like home." Linda smiled, her gaze warm. "Home isn't just a place, Robert. It's the people you share it with. And I think you found your place here." In the weeks that followed, Robert's life grew richer, filled with small moments that he cherished deeply. He took Eva and Leela on outings to the library, helped organize weekend events at the center, and even volunteered to coach the children's baseball team, a role that had once belonged to Caleb. Each day was a step further along his path, a journey of healing and redemption that had brought him closer to the son he had lost. One Saturday morning, as he was preparing for a baseball practice with the kids, Eva approached him with a letter in her hand, her expression hesitant. She glanced up at him, her gaze filled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "Mr. Langston," she began softly, "I got a letter from Northridge Academy. It's my acceptance letter." Robert's face broke into a wide smile, his heart swelling with pride. "Eva, that's wonderful news. You've worked so hard for this." She nodded, but her face held a flicker of doubt. "I'm excited, but I'm also scared. Caleb always told me I could do it, but now that it's real, I don't know if I'm ready." Robert knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're more than ready, Eva. Caleb believed in you, and so do I. You've shown so much strength and dedication. This is your moment, and I know you'll make him proud." Tears shimmered in her eyes, and she gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Langston, for everything." As the months turned to summer, Robert took on more responsibilities at the center, helping to expand its programs and secure funding. He had become an integral part of the community, a trusted mentor to the children, and a friend to the parents. He felt as if he were finally living the life Caleb had envisioned, a life of purpose and compassion. One day, as he was helping clean up after a summer camp session, he found a small envelope slipped into his briefcase. Inside was a letter, written in Caleb's handwriting, a letter Robert had never seen before. "Dad, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I know we've had our differences, and I know I haven't been the son you always wanted. But I believe in what I'm doing, and I hope, one day, you'll see it too. I hope you'll see that the legacy we leave isn't in the money we make or the deals we close. It's in the lives we touch, in the kindness we show. You taught me to be strong, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I also hope you find the courage to see the world through my eyes. With love, Caleb." Robert sat in silence, the weight of the letter pressing down on him like a tide. His son's words were a gift, a final message that bridged the gap between them. Tears filled his eyes, but they were tears of healing, a release of years of regret and pain. He folded the letter carefully, placing it close to his heart. Caleb's words had given him the closure he had needed, a reassurance that, despite their differences, his son had loved him, had respected him. And now, in honoring Caleb's legacy, Robert felt as if he had finally earned that love. On the anniversary of Caleb's death, Robert returned to the cemetery, a place that had once been filled with pain and emptiness. But today he felt a quiet peace as he stood before his son's headstone, a bouquet of flowers in his hands. Eva and Leela had joined him, their small hands holding his, offering him comfort and companionship. They stood in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice soft but steady. "Caleb, I wish I could tell you everything I've learned. I wish I could tell you how much you've changed my life. I thought I came here to honor you, but it's you who have given me a gift, a family, a purpose, a second chance." Eva placed a single white flower beside the headstone, her face serene. "We love you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and sorrow. Layla nodded, her eyes wide with innocence. "Thank you for bringing us together." As they stood there, a gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of flowers and the soft murmur of birds. It was as if Caleb were there with them, a quiet presence that filled the space between them, binding them together in a way that words could not. Robert felt a sense of closure, a final peace settling over him. He had spent his life searching for success, but he had found something far greater, a family bound not by blood, but by love, resilience, and shared dreams. Caleb's legacy had brought them together, creating a bond that would last a lifetime. In the years that followed, Robert continued his work at the community center, watching as the children grew, pursued their dreams, and became the young adults Caleb had always believed they could be. Eva went on to attend medical school, fulfilling her dream of helping others, while Leela blossomed into a talented artist, her work inspired by the love and support she had found in her community. Robert had become a beloved figure, a mentor, and a father to the children at the center. And though he had lost Caleb, he felt as if his son's spirit lived on, a guiding light that reminded him of what truly mattered. One evening, as he was locking up the center, he paused in the quiet hallway, his heart full. He could almost hear Caleb's laughter, feel his presence beside him, as if his son were watching over him, proud of the man he had become. "Thank you, Caleb," he whispered, his voice filled with love. "Thank you for showing me the way." And as he walked into the night, surrounded by the memories of his son and the family he had found, Robert knew that he had finally come home. In the end, Robert's journey had led him not to redemption, but to something even more profound, a life filled with love, purpose, and the quiet joy of knowing he had become the man his son had always believed he could be. Caleb's legacy lived on, woven into the fabric of a community that had grown and thrived, a testament to the power of love, kindness, and the gift of second chances.